Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first in the series of In Conversation With, hosted by myself, the Executive Officer for the Academy of Science of South Africa. I'm Himla Soodyall, and it is indeed a great pleasure for me to have two awesome activists and scientists in many fields of expertise, as we will hear during the conversation. The In Conversation series we championed a couple of years ago when we were during the lockdown phase. There was just so many things going on, and we had opportunities to speak with experts. And unlike our usual webinars, where we have lots of people on at the same time, the In Conversation series is earmarked for us to get a scientist or somebody interesting that we can speak with and get deeper into a conversation. So this is a very relaxed space. It's as imagine we're sitting in a coffee shop having a coffee and we haven't seen each other for years and we're just catching up. So that's what it is. Colleagues, welcome to you all for those of you who have joined us online. And my special guest today are Professor Debra Roberts. She's an honorary professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in the School of Life Sciences and has been an advisor for the Global Commission on Adaptation, United Cities and Local Governments, and of course the United Nations Secretary General's 2019 Climate Summit. She has a sterling record, which you can see in the flyer of the advertisement. But needless to say, she has played a very active role in the past 4 decades working on science policy practice interface in the fields of biodiversity planning and management, climate change adaptation and mitigation and sustainable development, and resilience at local and international levels. And my other guest is Professor Coleen Vogel. She's a distinguished professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, and she is a climatologist by training, but has increasingly worked in the social dimensions of climate change, focusing particularly on climate change adaptation. She currently serves on various local and international boards. But personally, Coleen has been a great advocate and friend of the Academy and assisted us in participation in many activities. But more so, I am pleasantly, surprised at the energy she has in stepping out of the ivory towers of universities and getting involved with young people and early career scientists and playing that active role as a mentor and inspiring, many of us in the periphery. So welcome to both of you. And today we just want to talk about issues related to global challenges, particularly those around, climate change issues. Debra, we're both sitting in KZN, and a couple of years ago, with all the floods that we have and the increasing rains and drainage problems, etc., it's a wonder that the beaches have been open this festive season. It's the first in many years that I've been here at my flat in Durban, where I was able to go to the beach. But yeah, so just to kind of kick us off, and Coleen, you can come in at any time. Remember, we're in a coffee shop. I'm sorry I can't offer you the coffee, but imagine we have a virtual coffee and we're sitting around a table and we're just catching up. So you can ask questions. Debra, you can, ask a question and give us some insights. It is an in conversation with me and you, and later on we will invite our audience to participate as well. So just to kind of kick us off, what is the biggest challenge we face globally, our planet is facing globally with respect to climate change? Debra, you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks, Himla. And Coleen, always good to see you. It feels like we're taking one of our interesting conversations and making them public today. So thanks very much for this platform, and thank you to everyone who's joined. and will listen into our conversation. You know, Himla, you described me as or the opportunity to participate here as being made available to scientists or interesting people. I'm not sure I'm a scientist anymore, but I hope to be an interesting person. And as you've indicated, I've spent 40 years working at the local level, predominantly with and in local government. And I think that does two things to someone who's trained in the natural sciences. It humbles you. It makes you realize that you truly don't understand the world. But it also cures you of any level of delusion, because I think you know, staying in research and academia can lead to a certain level of delusion about how the world really works. And having had 40 years at the local level, I believe I'm cured of that, more or less. So using that as my backdrop and thinking about the biggest change, I suppose my biggest worry at this point is that the world is deluding itself. It's not brave enough to have the truly difficult conversations. We face a wicked mix of problems. There's no escaping the pressures from biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, poverty, inequity. And that is speaking to a changed future, because our responses are not adequate to the task. It's not that we're not acting. We are acting across that spectrum, but we're not acting fast enough. We're not acting in a transformative enough way. And I think, you know, anyone who has got the vaguest degree of common sense, and my mother always told me, Debra, don't let your intelligence get in the way of your common sense, can see that we're probably not going to make the big targets. And the question then is, what sort of conversation should we be having? I believe we should be having a conversation that speaks to a world of 1.5 overshoot and what that might mean for a continent like Africa, what it might mean for our cities, and talk about that suboptimal future, because the world is not going to end. You know, if we don't make the 1.5 target, it's not like the lights are suddenly going to go out and that's the end of it. No, we will continue onwards, but it will be a difficult world. And what I'm finding is that the world's not prepared to talk about that in any brave or in any in-depth way. And I think that's hugely problematic. Local government teaches you to manage risk across a broad range of spectrums and scenarios. And I think there are important scenarios that we're not talking about.
Yeah. And Coleen, do you want to kind of chip in and add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as Debra has indicated, you know, it is quite a dystopian future, and it's quite difficult, especially I have young children in the ages of 30 upwards, and they are feeling very sad about the world. They're not sure if they're going to, you know, they're not excited to give me more grandchildren and, you know, basically saying, why would I want to do that? You know, there's Ukraine Monday, Gaza Tuesday, climate change Wednesday, land degradation Thursday. So how does one then kind of shift that conversation to inspire hope? Because I think we have to inspire hope. And for me, the biggest challenge, and maybe I'm sure Debra can come back in on this as well, is that I think we're isolating climate change too much as a science question, which I think it is. Obviously, it's very much a science question. But what climate change does normally is just unveil what's been going on in a local context. So you were talking about the beach, not being able to go down to the beach. When you get, you know, your big storms coming in, what they do is just lift the lid on the bad development or the good development or the bad policies or the legacies of previous government systems. So they don't necessarily create new challenges, but they kind of expose those existing challenges, and then those bounce up against each other and make a much, much bigger problem. So for me, what climate change, I think, urgently needs to do for us is to really make us aware of these multiple things that have been there all the time. And what climate change is now doing, unfortunately, too fast and too quickly and repeatedly, is unveiling those challenges. So if you talk to someone in South Africa now, they'll say service delivery is our biggest thing. It's not climate change. But what climate change is doing is pointing to where those hotspots are and what kind of, you know, governance systems we need. So it's hard to say what is climate change. I don't think it's only just around, you know, science. And personally, I don't think, I hate to say this in an ASSAf context, but I don't think science will be enough. We need to have multiple perspectives coming in. And that's a science in itself, I think. So I hope that makes some sense. Thanks.
No, you're absolutely right. So if we try to look at the problem, so there are those that are beyond the human factor, the human control, the natural disasters, etc. But others would argue, well, us humans are creating the problems on the planet, leading to changes in atmospheric pressures and the carbon factor, and you know the normal talk. So how would we kind of identify? I know it is a complex onion science technology. Everything is layered, but
Yeah.
those that are within our control and those that are outside our control, and how do we mitigate, if at all, to both the major branches of that scenario?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and perhaps I'm just going to be provocative here. You know, I really caution people about this bipolar society we created, where we're either hopeful or in deep despair. I would really urge us to throw that out. We don't have time for those kinds of emotions. We simply have to be practical. You know, the big driving forces are the ones we've created. Himla, you can throw out the natural disasters. We can survive those. Those are not problematic. All the big changes are us. Whether it's biodiversity or pollution or climate change or poverty and inequity. So, you know, forget Mother Nature. She ain't got nothing to do with us. It's all firmly in our court. The problem is you've got to be realistic about the world's power base. And this is another thing that scientists, other than the political scientists, don't like talking about, is politics and power. And quite frankly, there are a large number of people who are benefiting from the status quo. I mean, we're spending $7 trillion US, you know, per annum on fossil fuel subsidies. So there are huge benefits to be gained from keeping the status quo. I'll be challenging here. Africa has 30% of the world's minerals. A broad portion of those are the minerals needed for the energy transition. You know, why would the world want to see a strong Africa? You know, it's much easier to have a weak Africa in terms of keeping inequities in global trading systems so that those minerals can be easily accessed and exported. So, you know, we need to be pragmatic. The world is a very unequal pace. It's driven by power, it's driven by politics. And I have never met a situation where science goes up against politics and wins.
Right.
It may influence a discussion for a brief period of time, but I tell you, science has a shelf life. You can introduce a new idea. It might be sexy or grab the political mindset, but let me tell you, a week on, you'll need another new idea. And that's the reality we're not dealing with. And what I'm finding is we're not having enough of a discussion between the people from the natural and physical sciences and the people from the political and social sciences who actually understand how the world works. And because of that, we're not coming up with responses that are appropriate. And we need those kind of complex discussions. But again, we've got to break down scientific barriers to have those conversations. We've got to be brave enough to talking about the fact that there is no silver bullet. There's no technologies that's going to come and save us. But we need to be thinking about this complex future.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, also, if I can just chip in. So I think the notion of the sort of stereotypical scientist also needs to be, you know, put more in the spotlight. So many of us, I think Debra would classify herself the same as I classify. I'm a pracademic, right? How do we actually do practical things that can make a difference? But to do that, you have to shift out of your comfort zone. You have to become humble. I think Debra mentioned that right in the very beginning. And actually get onto the ground. You know, people have entrepreneurial ideas. They have knowledge systems. They have, you know, their own thoughts that they want to bring to the table. But because we still, as Debra has correctly said, putting things in silos and in boxes, you know, even in municipalities, and Debra can talk much more strongly to this than I can, but what I noticed when I worked with the municipalities is that the key performance indicators are so geared into boxes that we can't get people to think holistically around these things. And dare you even go and talk to civic society around these things. You know, it's the community outside the building on the hill, you know. So, yeah, I think we need to be opening up a lot more around what are the real power differentials, the inequities, but really not hiding. I think Debra used a nice phrase yesterday in an email that I shared with her, and she said, peering behind the curtain. you know, being brave enough to put ourselves in front of the curtain and still hoping that you have a job the next day, you know, at a formal job.
No, but I mean, obviously, this is an important component of our life because, as you say, fear of the future for the next generations to come, you know, gives us a very sobering moment to kind of contextualize the various challenges we are facing in the present. If I were to ask you to name 3 things in order of priority that you would want to see change to kind of make inroads to break down these silos, what would that be?
On my side, different training. You know, I think back to when I trained, so I've got a background in biology and chemistry, and I suppose looking back at it, one can laugh now, but you know, as the scientific group, we didn't even want to go to the other side of campus for fear that we'd be polluted by the social scientists who lurked on that side. You know, no one ever told me that I would have to talk to people for my science to have an impact. And I'm sure there are some scientists, you know, the blue sky scientists who are pushing hadrons around in CERN, who probably don't need to talk to people as much. But for those of us who look at the applied sciences, you've got to be able to talk to people. You've got to understand the motivations that drive people. So fundamentally, I think we all need a much broader training. Certainly those coming from the physical and natural sciences need to understand that they're going to have to be messengers. They're going to have to drive that science forward, and communication is important. I think it is important in the social sciences and humanities to understand the role of the natural and the physical sciences. So I think our training hinders us, but also, and how I would challenge ASSAf, you know, how many practitioner scientists do you have on your books? Do you actually acknowledge that those of us who use science in the real world are part of the scientific community? I can tell you that I've probably received more rejection for my knowledge from the scientific community than I have from the practitioner community, because that's the difficult thing of having a foot in both camps. Neither camp really trusts you. But certainly the distrust is far deeper from my scientific colleagues than it is from my practitioner colleagues. And so, you know, are groups like ASSAf doing enough to break down what is recognized as science? You know, because we perpetuate this notion of what science is, and all it is a way of knowing the world. It's not the only way of knowing the world. It's an important way of knowing the world. But I think we need to have a broader discussion about what knowledge is. And I'm sure Coleen has had that same experience. The moment you step out of the traditional academic researcher science type role, it becomes very, very difficult and challenging.
Yeah. Coleen, from your side?
Yeah, so I'll also be a little bit provocative, seeing as Debra's thrown that out there. So I think we need much more institutional change, transgressive shaking of the institutions, not too much because we need to keep them, but to actually just shake up things. So I'll give you a quick example. If I want to have my students go through and do a practical piece of work, talking to people, etc., and I want them to do it in an emergent, inclusive way. So the people are going to help us to identify what the problem is. They find it really hard to get that through various processes in the university, because the traditional science way is you have a problem, you identify your hypothesis, you go out, you do your methodology, and then you talk to people way down the line. And this is really baked into our systems, whether we're working at the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, all the way down to on the ground. So I think changing those perspectives so that they become ways of doing that are okay. It's okay to co-develop with another group. Otherwise, it still just becomes theoretical. So that goes to the kind of notion of transdisciplinarity, because I think many of my science colleagues think that transdisciplinary just means mixing a whole lot of disciplines together. Maths talks to physics, talks to, you know, human sciences, talks to piano makers or whatever. But the way we see, I think, the work that Debra and I are doing is that we're working outside the bounds of the university. We're not just doing our science and then throwing it over the wall, because that's the hard yards. You know, my science colleagues develop the climate model. Then they say, okay, Coleen, you take it over. And it's like getting the, what's it called? The hospital pass in rugby. You know you're going to hit into that line of defense as you go outside. But then I think the last point, and it really just endorses what I've been trying to say, is I think we're missing in our scope. The lens that we have isn't wide enough. So the agents of change who we normally interrogate. So I've had the wonderful opportunity as I start working with young people, they think differently. Thank God. Imagine if they were still thinking the way I was trained. So for example, social media, people who are in plays, in theater, in activist drama, in news, etc., the ways in which we can reach society and engage with society isn't through a journal paper that's baked into a library. But that's critical for those of us who need that system of promotion and whatever. But I do think trying to shift that lens a little bit and become more, dare I say it sounds so trite, action-oriented and just humble. People, if you walk through a shopping center, I often do this, or I come back on a plane from a conference, I look around the plane and I think, what would excite them about the meeting that I was just at? And then I have to go, I don't think anything, which is really terrible. So how do we get those communities engaged,
Yeah. No, I mean, both of you are speaking to a very important point, and I hope there are people in the NRF-based system and the broad spectrum of academia online. So firstly, Debra, I want to say that ASSAf uses the word science in a very holistic way. We've got social science, humanities, physicists, economists, biological scientists, the whole works. And we've got almost 680 plus members stratified across all of those disciplines. And when you ask for volunteers, or you want to talk about a topic like this on climate change, etc., and in fact, this is still in the making. But next year South Africa hosts the G20 presidency, and ASSAf will be required to put forward a meeting for the academies called the Science 20. And we've been toying with the idea of a topic around climate change and well-being. It's not casting stone, we're still having those sorts of discussions. And mainly because, as you both pointed out, almost everything we are concerned about is it's like a matrix. It's all intercalated, interwoven, and happening simultaneously. We're also punting the concept of polycrisis. There's multiple global challenges, and each has an effect on the other, and you can't do the one without the other. But you both highlighted, and I was just distracted a little bit, in that there are parametric ways of looking, metrics of academic growth, and then there's life activities. And if you apply for a promotion, there's a tick box you've got to go through. When you do this kind of intercalated work for the highlighting of science and the complexities of processes using science, there's no kudos for that unless you publish a paper in an impactful journal and you cite it, etc. So the system has to change. And this is a good point to kind of put that forward to the policymakers for why the system should change if we actually want to see sustainable development and growth. We talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. When we talk about it, then we have that radar on. The moment we walk out of that discussion, then we kicking stones and burning fires and all kinds of things happen. So how do you change the natural processes to one of activism, of conscientizing problems in a bigger way? And then that's something that's quite complex. And but we can talk about that in a little while. But while I have you experts with me, we talk about Africa's place in the world, and what can we do from the African context? One, to protect our continent and to help advance the thinking of the peoples on the continent around climate change issues. Now, we know that on the continent we have a large farming community. You talked about mining and the mineral wells, etc. So climate change is intricately interwoven with well-being, health, food productions, etc. How can we take a slight step ahead to kind of move Africa in a positive zone going forward? What should we do?
I think, we've got to take charge of our own story, thinking about both the worlds of practice and science. Very often the narrative that's linked to Africa is being told by others. If you look at the funding of research, barely 4% of the world's research on climate change is on Africa. And of that, 14%, so about 1% or so, goes to African research. So I think we've got to wrestle back, and it will be a wrestling back, our story. We've got to take control of the African narrative. We've got to be creating priorities that are important for us as we move forward. I just last week was in Nairobi, where a group of experts and the African negotiators got together because we're preparing for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 7th assessment report. And it was so empowering to hear Africans talking about Africa and stating African priorities as opposed to having those superimposed. But that does mean we've got to self-organize. It does require resources. So I think controlling that narrative is important. I think we've got to look at where we've got massive leverage for change. And unfortunately, when people talk about Africa, and indeed when we think about our own continent, we do think about her as largely rural. She isn't. She's the most rapidly urbanizing continent in the world. And if you're very practical about it, if you want a global scale opportunity to bend the curve on emissions, on vulnerability, on poverty and inequity, it's in the African city. But the African city is just so different to anything else that has appeared. It's a city that's emerged often without development. It's a city with high levels of informality, both across human settlements and across economies. It's a city often with unusual forms of governance because of that informality and restricted resources. It's a city which is strongly linked to its rural hinterlands, both in terms of dependence, in terms of resources like water, but also in terms of migration of people in and out. And we see that in our own province, KwaZulu-Natal. And I think that's an important conversation if we're interested in biodiversity, climate change, pollution, poverty, and equity. Having a narrative that suits the African city, and there isn't one African city. There are different universes of urbanism in Africa, in Southern, in Western, and Eastern, and in Northern Africa, but taking control of the story of the African city and how we build that out. Because we're going to spend about $94 trillion by 2040 on infrastructure, largely urban in the global South. It's a more enormous moment for change, but we've got to do that in a way that suits Africa and Africa's needs. And so the first thing for me is we need to tell an African story. We need to take control of that story again.
Yeah, but then also when you come to like agriculture on the African continent, a lot of that is done in the informal setting. How do you get the message? How do you get the big message out to people who are practicing, farming technologies, etc., in an informal way? So what mechanism does one reach out to those sorts of farming or farmers?
So if I can come in here and maybe be seriously provocative and might never get invited back for Christmas dinner. In the work that I used to do, which was in the rural communities, one often spoke about agricultural extension. And my experience, and maybe I was just exposed to really bad agricultural extension, but that goes back, circling back to my first point I made about changing the institutions or shaking them a bit. So I'm not sure that our agricultural extension is fit for purpose. So the way that we are giving certain institutions the credibility to pronounce
Yeah.
the message, if you like, is not the way it's still working. It's very different. You know, people have got cell phones, they've got, you know, access to lots more, to radio, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, it goes back to Debra's point about training, our agricultural colleges, the curriculums. So I think there's not, again, one quick snap bullet that you could just say, you know, ride around in a car with a loudhailer saying, you know, people know what's happening. People can tell you the seasons are changing, this type of crop isn't working anymore. But there are very few platforms. They do have their own platforms, local societies, local groups. The church is playing a very big role. But the formal accredited so-called institutions, I'm not sure are fit for purpose anymore. And if they are still fit for purpose, where is that voice coming in to help them actually have messages that are palatable? Because it kind of is not rocket science. You know, if you're wanting to get communities involved in something, but you're not talking their language, you know, it doesn't take a lot to say, well, nothing's going to move. And I think that's what's always dumbfounded me about the kind of work that I do, because it really ain't rocket scientists, you know, science. I'm actually married to a nuclear physicist, no longer a nuclear physicist. I don't think he could survive being married to me as a nuclear physicist. But, you know, sometimes you actually need to shake those systems. But I just wanted to quickly add to the question that you asked about Africa. I agree with Debra. We need to claim back our voice and really be bold. But by the same token, I think, and we are getting stronger at this, rather than being always, some people say, we always go sometimes with the begging bowl, always the victim mentality. I think we really need to be now stepping into the spotlight and really, you know, taking our science forward. And there I'd like to kind of make almost a contradiction to what I first said. Yes, you need to be a pracademic, but by the same token, I think we need to build critical theory that's based on good evidence base. So if we can feed the science with good practical examples of, you know, we all talk now about transformation in climate change, but you go very far. I'm busy involved in an assessment internationally, and we're struggling to find cases that actually show what we're trying to say. So for me, I think Debra made that point. We need to organize ourselves, get those platforms together, open the doors, make it open so that people can come into those spaces, and maybe through ASSAf, you know, you start running small dialogue sessions, bringing a minister in to talk to a young academic student, you know, bring a business person in, really open up the space. So it's multiple world views around the table. I'd definitely sign up to come to one of those, because I think by keeping it in, you know, when we come up with science plans, we always fall back to the safe zone, agriculture, water. And that's like a standard 5, but, you know, grade 7 textbook. And we've gone way beyond that now. We're way beyond. We need to be getting those cross-disciplinary, exciting things. And then just to support Debra, I mean, the cities, I think, are fascinating. And that's why I think we need to be drawing more on people who are living in those cities, the artists, the people on the ground, the social media activists, the informal groups who live in those environments much more closely than I or you and maybe Debra does, and get them to, you know, share their stories, because it's that complex. I mean, the academic work is this complex informality. What does that really mean? And then carrying that up to the big platforms internationally. But I think we can do it.
No, I mean, I think that should be a big, this topic should be one that we put out to the politicians and see who comes up with the best plan for voting on the 29th of May. Because this is the essence of it, right? I mean, if you can take your populace on a journey with you, with a good way forward for how we mitigate, not all, but some of it, you know, with baby steps. Right now, we've got it's like hub and spoke, you know, spokes with so many problems, each spoke representing a problem. Where do you start? Where do you start to fix things? Colleagues, there are lots of things coming up on the chat. I'm sure the Q&A is also open for you to contribute your questions. In a few minutes, I will open that up to have an engagement. There's already quite an interesting discussion on the chat where somebody asked a question and Professor Klute has given a response. So if you can just cast your eyes through those as we talk. But one of my friends asked me to ask a question about how climate change affects the ocean. Do you want to say something to that point? As ocean science is also very exotic. I mean, the biodiversity. When I stand at the seashore and my feet are touching the Indian Ocean, you're touching a body mass of oceanic water that surrounds the entire, Earth in the various oceans, and it stays intact. It doesn't like go up into the sky because of gravity. And I mean, I know I'm jumping the gun, but this is my excitement when I stand there and I see I'm at the water's edge. There's the land and there's the ocean, and it's so spectacular. But of course, the ocean plays a very, very important role in our lives. How is all of this impacted with the climate considerations?
Yeah, so I mean, I was in an interesting position in this last assessment cycle of the IPCC. I was partnered with a German co-chair who is a marine ecophysiologist. And we oversaw a special report on oceans and cryosphere. And in our discussions, we often bemuse that these two big dominant factors on the globe, this massive period of urbanization, the fastest in our species' history, and the ocean, which is the predominant state of the world, are often neglected in the formal negotiations. So climate change, until recently, has been urban blind and it's been ocean blind. And as you say, Himla, the ocean is a hugely significant system for us. It's absorbed 90% of the heat that's been generated to date. And I'm sure you would have seen over the last 12 months the increasing concern about the number of marine heat waves that are being experienced and the high marine temperatures that are being measured. Not entirely clear why. Does this have something to do with El Nino together with the global warming? But that's acted as a huge buffer. But there are limits to what the ocean can do. There's inertia in that ocean system. And I suppose the bigger worry, because it is such a dominant system for the planet, is as people begin to talk about geoengineering, they're beginning to talk about modifying the ocean in some ways. So it has been an enormous source of buffering for us by absorbing that heat, but the high levels of marine heat waves, the increased ocean acidification, the bleaching of the coral reefs that we're seeing. In fact, the warm water corals are the first, we believe, that will pass into likely extinction in many places in the world if we cross 1.5. So in many ways, the coral reefs are the Amazon forests of the ocean. So significant loss there. My bigger worry is that we might be beginning to look for easy outs. In a lot of the conversations I'm a part of, people are constantly searching for the technological bullet that's going to save us. And the increasing discussion around solar radiation management, around geoengineering, particularly using the oceans, that's very worrying. We barely understand the ocean systems as it is, but we've kind of got a scenario where a recently evolved primate species is now sitting like a learner driver and trying to drive this planet, and we're not doing a very good job of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, scary stuff. I'm going to ask one last question before I open up for discussion, because I think the audience is very excited to talk with both of you as well. We had scenarios in the past where we had very little human intervention, like the Ice Age. When the Earth was covered with ice, and that's created barriers in terms of movements of early humans, etc. And so if you follow the climatic patterns over the eons, you see these dips, etc. Where are we going? Where are we going with this kind of scenario? Is what we're going through at the moment a similar sort of scenario as we had with the Ice Age, and now it's the heat phase? Is this something that happens, or is it a human factor?
I see Coleen has disappeared, so maybe I'll venture into that. No, absolutely not. If you look at the most recent IPCC reports from the sixth assessment cycle, we indicate that all of the change is due to human activity. So the IPCC has increasingly enhanced its level of confidence around its assessment. So if you look at the globe over the last several hundred million years, of course, you've seen variation in temperatures, but the rate of change and the cause of that change currently is far faster, and it's human driven. It's the use of fossil fuels and obviously things like deforestation that are driving that. So this is definitely not natural. We're currently literally going to turn the Anthropocene into the new Pliocene. So the last time we saw temperatures and carbon dioxide levels of this sort of levels, so over 400 parts per million, was in fact in the Pliocene 3 million years ago. And remember, then it was 2 to 4 degrees hotter, and sea level rise were up to 25 meters higher. So this is all on us, as I said at the beginning. This is not a natural cycle. It's in our hands to do something about it. The problem is the rate of scale of change is now so fast that we're putting huge pressures not only on natural systems, but human systems. And certainly the science is very clear. If we move into a world of 1.5 degrees overshoot, we will begin to see irreversible change then. We're driving the planet into an entirely new state. For me, the bigger debate is...
Can we avoid it with the rate at which cultural evolution is taking place?
Well, this is, again, one of these honest questions we've got to ask. Theoretically, we should have been able to avoid it. You know, when Jim Hansen first stood up in Congress and pointed to a human cause behind climate change, if we had acted then and acted ambitiously, we could have done something about it. I, quite frankly, as someone who's spent 40 years working in a highly politicized environment, begin to wonder, given the current state of geopolitics and the current state of the world economy, whether we've got the ability to act as fast as we need to. Effectively, by the end of this decade, we've got to reduce emissions by about 50% in order to keep us on track to 1.5. We reached the highest level of carbon dioxide emissions last year. We're currently at 419 parts per million. We had the hottest year on record. We've had the first year where the global average temperature exceeds 1.5. Doesn't mean the global goal is yet past us, but the indications are all there. I think we will change. I don't think we will change fast enough, which is why we've got to have this debate about what it means to live in the suboptimal world of 1.5 overshoot.
Coleen?
Yeah, and you know, more critically, it does come down to, and I don't want to sound banal here, but it comes down to the power game. You know, who's winning, who's going to be losing, what are the trade-offs? You know, I think most people in the world now are saying, yes, we can see the changes. Yes, fossil fuels are the problem. But what does that mean in a country like South Africa with the employment story that we have? Can one just peak and then drop rapidly off, or do you have to peak and plateau and then turn down, you know, the various causal agents of the fossil fuel industry, per se? And then what will that mean? So this isn't an easy conversation. And I agree with Debra. We need to be having these discussions much, much more seriously. And you mentioned the political parties earlier, and I might not have done my homework properly, but very few of them, I don't see them having on their manifestos, what are they doing? Yeah. And we don't even tackle that. You know, we kind of just go like, who are you voting for? Well, I don't even know. Is there someone who I should be voting for? But there's no evidence. There's nothing that people can take and use. And I think both Debra and I are making the plea that, you know, a colleague of mine from Norway has written a book, Karen O'Brien, called You Matter More Than You Think. We as human beings can do something. It's not all lost. And, you know, instead of having a nice cup of tea, like you said, in the restaurant, we should be maybe drinking a gin and tonic because it's all, you know, let's just drink and be merry. I don't think, you know, I think we can do so much. And that's why I get so excited when I'm with the young people, because although there is a huge despair coming from those people, younger communities, there's also this, we've got to do something. We've got to shift. We've got to change. But I think it does go back to power, and I think it goes back to rethinking our institutions. What do they look like? What are they standing for? And then all of us asking, you know, what does it mean for me where I live? What role do I play in this whole system? You know, what amazes me in Johannesburg, for example, we don't have a waste collection system that allows you to have, you can put your bin out with different bottles and then to waste, which I can't believe that we don't have, so how can I be proactive? Because you were talking about the oceans, the plastics, someone was actually saying that if we can look at the world differently, that we are connected to nature, we are intimately related. Nature is not just something that we use, and then when we finish, we leave and drive back to Gauteng because we've had our holiday, at the sea. It's a living entity, and if we could give it that respect. And so I do think there's wonderful opportunities, but we're limiting our imagination because we trained, I'm trained, and Debra's trained, and you as well, positivist science, which is great. But what about the arts? What about the creative disciplines? Open it up so that our imaginations can start to fly. So some of our colleagues are looking at, fiction. How can science fiction, can we begin to even imagine what this new world could look like, and then start stepping back from that?
No, you had too much of sugar over the weekend, Coleen.
I think that's what it's going to take. Lots of sugar in my gin and tonic.
Yes, so I'm going to pause with you all because there's a lot going on the chat. Professor Klutter has been responding to some things. Eugene, can we patch you on to say a few words? Professor Klutter is on our council and very strong on this topic and been responding to some questions. Henriette, can you see if Professor Klutter is willing to say a few words? Yeah, he's on the chat. Eugene, welcome.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much, Himla. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you very much for a very fruitful and a very useful discussion. I think we are all grappling with the same kind of problem. If we just go back to ecological principles, and if we consider the fact that we are in an Earth overshoot of about 25%, I think we're dealing with an immediate problem here in terms of overpopulation and overconsumption, leading to migration, as I've indicated in the chat, but also to uncertainty, all the wars we see going on, and then also the increase in nationalism, where you close your borders to protect your habitat. So I don't have a firm solution to this problem because I don't think there is one. What we will have to do is to adapt to the changing circumstances around us as the world heats up. In fact, in ecosystems, you normally have a major catastrophe, which pushes the carrying capacity back into what the system can handle. It's often lower than what the system can handle. And this might be it. Climate change and the changes coming with that is probably going to have that effect. Interestingly enough, and one of the two guests mentioned that we as humans have had a major impact on species diversity, for instance, and that is true. And this has been brought about to a large extent. The largest impact on species diversity has been agricultural land to, in fact, feed the world population. So there are two major things we need to address. The one is population growth. I have no doubt that we have to curb the population growth and specifically the population growth in Africa. It's estimated that the population will be close to 5 billion by the year 2100. That means we add China and we add India and we add another Africa to the African continent, where the average age is 17. There is no way that we will be able to provide the infrastructure and urbanization that comes with that. It will become a very, very difficult place to live in. So just a few ideas. I'd like to stop there, just to say the complex problem that we deal with here has got many moving parts. And I think from a practical perspective, we have to do what we can at the individual level. And the question was asked, how do we change human behavior? We do that by ownership and value. As soon as we as humans see ownership of something that has value, we change our behavior. And I think this is what we should be focusing on. You say, well, if we don't own this problem, if we don't see the value in curbing this problem, we as a human race stand the chance to become extinct within the next 150 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Eugene. Anybody wants to respond? And anyone else who wants to ask a question, if you show your hand, Henriette and Renata will patch you in.
If I may, thanks very much for that insight. And population growth always often comes up. And no doubt the issue about resource utilization and how many people can be supported by resources has always been important. But I do think the scientists and the academics have been doing a lot of critique on some of those notions. You know, the neo-Malthusian debate. Is it all about population growth? And who is at the back, again, behind the curtain, if you like, the puppet masters who are pulling the strings, who are really allocating the resources in society? Is it only just about population growth? Or is it about who is allocating the resources for what purposes? What are the power dynamics within those? So I'm sure you will agree, it's not a simple question just about, you know, as long as, you know, they've tried in other countries to have zero population growth, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure that it is only a, you know, lots of people, et cetera, causing a huge problem. I do think, and this is where the African continent and the African scholars and community can make a huge impact. And we're busy trying to do this with the transformation assessment in EPBES. What is the role of coloniality? What of the, you know, the colonial powers where, you know, resource extractivism has been huge. So I think we really need to get into some of the critical analysis underneath some of these things that we are seeing so that we start having really robust debates and also then drawing in others. But I do take your point. Obviously, it does begin. The personal transformation is critical. Otherwise, we can't really expect anyone else to do that. But I do think we need to really take that notion of population control, resource use, who gets access to resources, how they've got access to resources, and really take it into the realms with our political scientists and others to interrogate that further. But thanks for the input. Thank you.
Yeah. For me, an important element to emerge from that conversation, I agree very much with Coleen. Definitely numbers and consumption are in the mix. We can't escape that. But the fact is we are facing a tough future because the political systems, that distribution of power is unequal. There's no easy answer at this particular point in time. You know, in all honesty, to everyone who is on this call, if we were all born as heirs or heiresses to a trust fund and lived in Martha's Vineyard, would we even know that Africa existed? You know, and would we change? And that's the point, is people who have are probably going to defend their right to continue having. I had a really interesting experience. We did some IPCC outreach at a small liberal arts college in the US that will remain nameless. And we spent a week there. And the idea was, because it's an undergraduate college, we would have time to talk to these emerging students and scholars. And we had lunches with them, so we got to know them. And at the beginning part of the week, the conversations were we're all deeply concerned about climate change. We really want to work on this. We're deeply concerned about this. And so I started to change the narrative and said, you've got to move that from the abstract. People are currently dying in Africa because of climate change, which means we need to have a redistribution of resources. We need to think about how we live our lives. Some people have to change the way they live their lives. It doesn't necessarily mean a poorer quality of life, but resources will have to move because we've got a finite earth. We are already in a period of enormous overshoot and overconsumption, which means those who have will have to give to those who don't have at this point. And the conversation changed immediately. These young people who at the beginning of the week were very excited to work on climate change then began to push back, saying that that will interrupt my ability to make choices in my own life. I don't know that I feel comfortable with that. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, we talk a lot about the youth potentially as being our saviors. Well, remember in the 60s when the youth rose up and protested for a more peaceful earth, those boomers are now controlling some of the biggest industries in the world. So I don't think we should put that huge responsibility on the youth. They will be under their own pressure. And you know, I'm not as hopeful that when it comes to giving up stuff, that some will want to do that as much as is necessary. So it's complex. The big question then is who's going to lose, because we will face win-lose scenarios. We've got to identify who's going to lose in the natural world, in the human world, and think about how we keep options on the table under those sets of circumstances, because no doubt we will keep acting on this, but there are going to be people who lose now. We can't avoid that. What are we going to do about it is the key question.
Yeah, no, these are serious, serious considerations. Michelle Toucher is quite active on the chat. Michelle, do you want to say something or respond to some of the comments you've heard that you've been posting on the chat? Welcome, Michelle. Go ahead. Can unmute. Michelle, we've beamed you up onto the chat box. If you unmute, you could say something. Okay. All right. Is there anybody else who would like to say something? If you put your hand up or raise your hand, we will identify you and invite you to say a few words. Henriette or Renata, is there anything from the chat that tweaks your eye that you'd like to read out?
Julia has her hand raised.
Has a hand up, yeah. Julia Taylor, yeah.
Julia, there we go. Julia, you are in the room. To unmute, there you go.
Thank you so much. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Yeah, I think the kind of points made by both speakers are really valuable, particularly for us in universities to think about. I wanted to make just a last comment on this kind of overpopulation question. And I wanted to kind of highlight why I think it's so dangerous for environmentalists and scientists to focus on overpopulation. You know, the Malthusian theory has been used to justify Nazi experimentation and genocide. There's an extremely racist undercurrent to the overpopulation debate. And I think what's really important for us to keep in mind is that, kind of exactly as someone else posted recently on the chat, the kind of top emitters and the reasons for climate change are the fossil fuel kind of emissions. And that is largely from the industrialized countries. And we can't, in South Africa, escape blame because we also have significant emissions. But I just want to highlight, yeah, there's, I think, a whole story within our political economy and our economic system that we can't ignore by saying it's population. There's extreme inequality and kind of overconsumption and kind of luxury excess that is kind of seen as aspirational, which I think we really need to start challenging. And kind of to bring in one of Coleen's points, this is why we have to really connect our research to experiences on the ground. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll give a chance to kind of pick up on things, but somebody's just WhatsApped me and asked if you could comment on renewable energy and how much of renewable energy do we need to stop climate change?
Well, I mean, if you look at the current debates and the conversations that were had at last year's COP, which itself spoke to excess and overconsumption, with 100,000 people all gathering in one place in the middle of a desert. The idea is we've got to triple the use of renewable energy and partner that with a doubling of energy efficiency. Is the current mantra that is out there. If you look at the International Energy Agency report released at the end of last year, they indicated that there is now an unstoppable shift to the use of renewable through solar and wind energy, for example. But unfortunately, that's still not enough to bring emissions in line with the most ambitious aspirations of the Paris Agreement, which is that 1.5. So I think that's the challenge, is we will see renewables simply because of the push of economies. They're becoming cheaper, more accessible, will increasingly enter the market. But at the same time that is happening, if you look at the production report, it indicates that governments are planning to extract twice as much fossil fuel as is in line with 1.5-degree target by 2030. So that's the problem, is renewable is on the increase, but there's still such a lot of money in fossil fuels given the subsidies. And then you get into tricky debates around development. You know, who has the right to use that remaining carbon space? And particularly when you look at Africa, you know, we've got underdevelopment problems. A lot of our poverty is linked to that. And our population will increase. I've not heard as higher figures as Eugene said. The papers I've read suggest about 3 billion by the end of the century. But you can't have 3 billion people isolated from development opportunities. So the question is, who has the right to that carbon space? And that gets into very tricky politics of common but differentiated responsibilities that have been, you know, the thorn in the side of climate negotiations for many, many decades. And it goes back to Coleen's point. This is all ultimately about the control of resources and power, you know, and in that world, science has a tough time to punch above its weight.
Thank you. Colleagues, I mean, I don't know where this time has gone. You'd both have to come back and join me again, because I think you know, you both asked for us to host these sorts of things to get the messages across. And perhaps when school's back in session during National Science Week, we should have another conversation targeted at, you know, scholars, so we can pitch it to that level for them. I'm sorry, there's been so many comments on the chat, and sitting here with the humidity, I don't know how you feel, Debra, where you are, but my glasses keep getting fogged and I can barely read the things in the chat. But I'm sure we will obviously save all of that and try to put it together. But oh, there's a question in the Q&A. Malika Sardesh Pandey. A lot of climate change conversation makes people feel powerless. Example, targets doomsday's complexity, or puts people against one another with respect to population, veganism, protesters. How do we get to messaging that helps people understand that personal actions and system change are on the same scale? I don't know if I read the question clearly or whether you've seen it, but it basically is that people feel powerless on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, these sorts of discussions puts one group up against another, you know, talking about, let's say, carbon emission, methane gas, and vegetarianism and veganism, etc. So basically, there are two concepts here. One, that some people feel powerless, that they're seeing a doomsday ahead. And the other one is, given the complexity of which side of the fence you sit on, sometimes people are at odds with each other. How would one try to respond to those issues?
Yeah. On my side, it goes back to the powerful point that Coleen made, is you simply can't continue to separate climate change from a broader development debate. And it's because climate change sits on the side, you know, so you've got to do something extra to deal with that climate change aspect of your life. So become a vegan, you know, move to a solar powered geyser, et cetera, et cetera. I think if we mainstreamed climate change into development options and development choices, that would begin to shift the needle, actually drew it into development choices. I mean, many of the communities I and my staff in local government worked with, they have no tolerance for hearing about climate change. You know, they are poor people often living in informal settlements or peri-urban areas, I think climate change will never be on their radar. What they are interested in is development opportunities for them as individuals, their family, their community, and we're not integrating it enough. And it goes again to the second valuable point that Coleen made. It's because behind this global climate narrative, people are pulling the strings. You know, the international negotiations have very clearly said that to get climate finance, you've got to demonstrate additionality. You've got to be able to show that your intervention will deal with climate change, only you can't lead into development. And I think it's time to break down those walls, to say this is a development challenge. It's not something to be sitting, you know, and bemoaning our fate around. This is a fundamental development challenge. It means we've got to change the way we provide infrastructure development choices, so people have choices about how they can live their lives in a way that is climate resilient and you know, produces a low carbon outcome. Until we've got that kind of platform, it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with the challenges that the person specified in that question.
Yeah. Coleen, perhaps you could take this one. There are likely to be fewer habitat places for humans going forward, habitable places for humans going forward. How do we deal with this?
Sorry, just repeat the question. So fewer habitable
places for people going forward.
Well, you know, I mean, I think obviously the outlooks for biodiversity and this notion of pristine environments, again, I think is a huge debate that we can have with a number of interesting scholars. So I'm not sure whether it is a negative outlook. So we can just read the negative out numbers and say, there's going to be fewer, we're just going to have to, you know, do something different. Like people are saying, eat differently, you know, drink differently, whatever. But I'm not sure. I think we can start to change the narrative right now. And I wanted to piggyback this on to the previous question that you had. I mean, I think there are different levels at which we should be engaging. So the scientists who are at the meta level, the ones that really go to the COPs and go to the big debates, et cetera, they need to have a narrative and, you know, get that narrative sorted for Africa. And they are doing that. Debra's a champion of that, and deal with that. But what saddens me is that on the ground, at the ground level, where we all live, we need to shift the paradigm of what's going on the ground. So when I drive around Joburg, you know, people don't respect traffic lights anymore. The potholes are everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. So how can I get engineers who are we training at the university together with some artists, or I don't know, bring in groups that can make us start to have conversations, training in planning. The planners are not, I don't think, in our cities taking into account climate change. So how do we shift those very small debates? And it goes back to my very maybe pathetic example. I mean, I'm trying in my complex in Johannesburg to get people to separate waste. You know, what shocks me is that COVID didn't seem to make us stop at all. We stopped for a little time, and then we just went back to normal. You know, has HIV/AIDS made us stop and really think about issues? And whatever those issues are. And now climate change is shining a light again on a number of intersectionalities. And I think we're not bringing enough tools to the table, or, you know, implements and whatever we can use. So I would really call, and I'm going to end on this because I'm sure we're running out of time. We need to open the imaginary. We need to open the discourses, have platforms. If we could have the platforms at ASSAf where, you know, a rock artist comes together with a painter, comes together with a politician. I mean, it might go nowhere, but who knows? We might all become, you know, musicians instead of scientists.
You know, people always knock us up for leaving out social sciences and humanities people. We don't. We are very inclusive. And I am yet to see the social sciences and humanities ASSAf members come to me with an idea to say,
okay, so
we would like to do this, or we would like to that. So my call and my plea is to everyone, not just the social sciences and humanities. We are all in this together.
Right.
And if we are going to fail as a society, it doesn't matter which walk of discipline of life or science we are from, we're going to be hit equally. So I get your messages that we should all work together as a common unit to face, one challenge or baby steps. We can't eat that elephant all up in one go. We got to bite at it in bite sizes. Colleagues, I know we would love to have our guests go on with us, but I did promise that we we would only borrow an hour out of their busy schedules to join us in this conversation. My goodness, I mean, this is absolutely brilliant. Next time we will have it at a gin and tonic time later when more people can join in. But on behalf of all of us, I really, really want to thank both Debra and Coleen for joining us. I want to thank you, active participants who have been posting on the chat, and to Prof Kluter and Julia for joining us in sharing your thoughts on the conversation spotlight. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Raj, Mahabir, Aluwani, Renata, and Henriette for doing a lot of the background work in setting this up. I know it's a day after a long weekend and some people may still be in the holiday mood. I'm sorry that we broke the spell, but at least you've conscientized us with your wisdom of how we should tackle things, what we should be aware of, and that we are living in very challenging times. So when you go out on the 29th of May to cast your vote, make sure you ask all your politicians ahead of time, what will you do to mitigate climate change? Because the challenge has come from the experts in the field, some who do not want to be named as scientists, but scientists of great acclaim. But all I want to say in closing is thanks to everybody for actively participating, for joining us in this discussion. And I honestly hope that the two of you would join us again in picking up some of these issues. I know you're very, very busy people, but it is usually the busy ones who have the knowledge to share. And you've done it in such an eloquent, user-friendly way that everyone or anyone could have been part of this discussion and been excited by what you have said. Thank you all once again and have a good day going forward. Until we meet again, all the best.